Hi, everybody. My name is Wilbur Ince, and this is the Group 37 monthly meeting for April of 2022. This is the second half of our meeting, and we're pleased to present James Roth, who is going to share his presentation called Racism in the Minneapolis Police Department. With that, I'm just going to turn it over to Jim, and he can give a little introduction about himself, and we'll start the presentation. Take it away, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Wilbur. My name is Jim Roth. Sometimes formally I go by James, but I'm a retired lawyer. I was in private practice for 30 years, mainly did commercial litigation, but it did include civil rights litigation and a lot of employment law. I've been a long time international human rights activist. I was one of the co-founders along with David Weisbrod and Mayor Don Fraser of the Advocates for Human Rights. And I was active in the formation of the Center for Victims of Torture and served on both boards for many years. So I would say international human rights is my avocation. That being said, I don't want to say anything more about myself, but I know you all have the same reaction. I was totally horrified when I saw that video of George Floyd being murdered. And as a longtime international human rights activist, I immediately thought, you know, this happened 2 blocks away or 2 miles away from where we live. And how will others around the world react to what we do at home in terms of human rights or international human rights? And the next day, I got a telephone call from a longtime friend who's the former mayor of Miami, Florida, Manny Diaz, and he was horrified. And he said, "What can I do to help?" And then a couple of days later, we got a call from another longtime friend in Ottawa, Canada, who's a retired police officer, who said, "What can we do to help?" And so I already had an idea of, you know, the impact of this video being spread around the world, but it hit home even more to me when these longtime friends from other places came to me and said, "What can we do to help?" And so one of the things that I thought is, well, what can I do to help? So I immediately looked at it through the lens of international human rights. And, I've done lobbying in St. Paul and in Washington on human rights issues. And, our friend Manny Diaz, the former mayor of Miami, said, "You have to start at the city level." And since he had a lot of experience at doing this, I thought, well, he's probably right. And I have little to none experience lobbying at the city level because I just didn't feel it was that important for me in the past. Maybe I was wrong about that. But one of the other things that made me take a deeper dive into this is I'm one of those who's of a certain age where we can audit courses for free at Minnesota public institutions. And I'm a graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. And I decided, well, I'm just going to go back to law school because since I've graduated, there's been an immense development in terms of the course offerings on international human rights at the University of Minnesota Law School. To tell you the truth, there wasn't even one course when I graduated. Now there are lots. And I want to kind of circle back to David Weisbrod because he's, well, I call him an incubator for human rights. I met him when I was in law school, but he had been there for such a short time that there was no international law school course or curriculum. But that all changed under him. In addition to bringing in a lot of younger professors and very bright professors, they established a very strong curriculum, maybe one of the best in the world on international human rights. And he also established a human rights center at the University Law School, which was one of the first of its kind in the country. So anyway, I decided one thing I can do is learn some more about international human rights. So last fall, I took 3 courses, and the courses I took were international human rights law. And I was very fortunate to be able to take that course from Professor Neil Lane, and I'll talk a little bit more about her in a while. I took a course on poverty and human rights from Amanda Lyons, who's the executive director of the Human Rights Center. And specifically, I took a course on the rule of law by Professor Robert Stein. And they all have very distinguished backgrounds and impressive credentials. But among those that stood out to me is Professor Stein was actually one of my professors the first year I was in law school. He eventually became dean of the law school. Then he left for a while to become executive director of the American Bar Association. And while he was executive director of the American Bar Association, they had an initiative called the Rule of Law. And it was designed to deal primarily with countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It has since expanded. It's quite a wide-reaching project. But he later left the ABA and came back to the University of Minnesota Law School. But he is a widely renowned resource on the topic of the rule of law. And so taking his course was the second inspiration for my paper. The first was George Floyd. The second was taking the rule of law course. And so I think we can start the slides, Wilbur, if you're ready.
Yep.
So, as a senior student, I don't have to write papers or take exams. I even joke with the students that I don't even have to show up if I don't want to. But one of the specific reasons I took this course is I wanted to write a paper on this. And this PowerPoint is something that we developed in connection with a class presentation on that project. Next slide, please. Okay, so I started with the land acknowledgement. I won't go into it in detail here because they did have a very good land acknowledgement at the beginning of this meeting, but I always try to include that in any presentation that I make now. But we can skip ahead to the next one. Okay, I did take a pretty deep dive into these issues because even though I had some idea, vaguely, as a practicing lawyer, that there were abuses taking place, I never really looked at it in any kind of extreme detail. I kind of deferred to others who had more expertise in terms of bringing cases against police officers for excessive use of force, and some activists who were working on trying to reform the Minneapolis Police Department. But now that I decided to look into it, I found that there's a very long history of excessive use of force by police officers against BIPOC persons. And so the murder of George Floyd was really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I was really moved by the statement that he made several times as he was dying, "I can't breathe," because that's a very strong metaphor in terms of the way a lot of our minority citizens in our society feel about the Minneapolis Police Department. And, it was because that young woman recorded it on her cell phone and uploaded it that any of us knew about it. I mean, in the police report itself, it was being covered up. And I also thought back to the beating of King in 1994 in Los Angeles, Rodney King, and the only way we knew about that is because it was recorded on somebody's cell phone from across the street. But nevertheless, I mean, the murder of George Floyd ignited a response that I think few of us imagined in terms of the protests locally and around the country and around the world. I was always amazed when I would see pictures of things that were taking place in countries in Europe and in Australia, in Canada. So they were happening in many parts of the world. And so that too inspired me that, okay, we have to do something. Yes, it's horrible, but we have to do something. So next slide, please. So in my paper, one of the things that I did is I studied as deeply as I could the history of the Minneapolis Police Department. And that included interviewing some history professors. I'm not a historian, I don't pretend to be, but I know people who are, and there are a couple of history professors at Augsburg College who have a lot of familiarity with this issue. One of them is William Green, who participated in some of the police review boards, and also for a while was the chair of the Minneapolis School Board. But he was very gracious in terms of spending time with me. And he directed me to one of his colleagues, Professor Michael Lansing. And Michael Lansing is really focusing on this issue. He had written an article in the Minnesota Historical Society magazine on the Minneapolis Police Federation primarily. And so I read that article and I interviewed him, and he shared with me lots of ideas in terms of where I needed to go to find more information. And I did follow his recommendations. But so what I found is that these accusations of racism go back decades in terms of even specific cases that are referred to. Many of them are cited in my paper, but there are lots more. If you want to look at even more than the ones I specifically refer to in the paper, look at the report that I cited in my paper that was done by Dr. Herman Milligan in the mid-1980s. He really took, he's a criminologist, and he took a really deep look into these issues, and they held a couple of days of hearings, and it was a very impressive report. You can get a lot more information from reading his report, which I have cited. I also looked into the statistical evidence of racial disparities in the use of force, and they're stark. And then at the administrative and legislative efforts that were being made at reform, the proposals that were made for the abolition of the Minneapolis Police Department and prisons by various groups, the charter amendments, which at least most of us in Minneapolis are familiar with, and then tried to come up with some proposed solutions. So next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the framework for looking at the rule of law, there are a couple of standards that I tried to apply most specifically to these. And one is laws have to be equally applied and laws have to be just. And specifically, I then, in terms of the substantive law, I looked at the founding documents of the United Nations and some of the subsequent documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in particular interest for this paper, the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which has been ratified by the US. And then I kind of examined the issue of what's the difference of rule by law and rule of law. So, I mean, one thing is, it's really easy to say, okay, we're gonna have the rule of law. We're gonna impose law and order. And that basically is the rule by law. The rule of law requires incorporating issues like equal application and just laws. So that is the lens that I wanted to look at this. Next slide, please. Yeah, I mentioned here there is no extensive objective history. I saw in the comments somebody said, well, look at the MPD piece. And yes, I did look at that. And it is the most comprehensive history that I've seen, it is an advocacy piece, and it does argue for the abolition of the Minneapolis Police Department. And I'll get into that in a while when I get into the review of the groups that are advocating for that and the conclusions that I arrived at least so far. Unlike some other cities, Minneapolis doesn't have like an extensive archive of city records. There is more information available recently from the Minneapolis Police Department itself, but looking at city records is not very useful in terms of studying the history of the Minneapolis Police Department. The police department was established in 1867. From reviewing the records that are available, it sounds like the existing mayor then said, well, how can I be a mayor without an army, essentially? So they set up a small police force so he could have his army. Obviously, that was in the period after the Civil War and the US Dakota Wars. And MPD 150 and others have concluded that it was established as a racist institution from the start. I won't go into all these details that I went to in my paper about what happened between 1867 and 1945. I did go into that in quite a bit of detail in the paper. So if you want to see that, I invite you to look at the paper itself. There was an enormous amount of corruption during that time period. And it really continued up into the 1940s when Hubert Humphrey became the mayor. I mean, obviously, during the 1920s and 1930s, a lot of it was influenced by the Volstead Act, outlawing alcohol. But there was an enormous amount of corruption even before that. And in fact, some of the people who have written about that time period basically have concluded that the mayor would hire personal friends and family members, and they really acted like personal thugs for the mayor. But yeah, you can look into that in more detail. The Minneapolis Federation of Police Officers was formed in 1917. It was somewhat active. Honestly, it became much more robust when the Minnesota Public Employee Labor Relations Act was passed in 1971. And I will get back into that when I talk about some solutions. I looked at the racial demographics, and BIPOC people constituted less than 5% of the Minneapolis population in the 1970s. They were disproportionately affected by police violence, but now it's 20% plus. And I think that has had an impact too on the extent of police violence. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this I found interesting, and this actually came from one of Professor Lansing's articles. In 1949, the president of the Police Officers Federation agreed that policemen should not attempt to influence government or the outcome of elections, or we would have the makings of a police state. Well, a series of police chiefs, more recently especially, have attempted to reform the police department and address racism, and I have a list of them here. I want to circle back to what I referred to as the report that was prepared in the mid-1980s by Dr. Milligan and his colleagues, the Special Task Force on Minneapolis Police Department Treatment of Protected Class Individuals. That was one of the most useful resources that I found, and I do recommend looking at that report and at all of the sources that it cites to take a closer look at this. My conclusion was that various forms of civilian review boards have come and gone. But both informed by my interviews and by the documents that I read, I concluded that they were undermined or constrained by the Police Officers Federation in every instance. And I go into that in more detail in the paper, but next slide, please. Okay, the Department of Justice has intervened in various ways for decades. There have been mediation programs, there have been studies, there have been recommendations. The most recent one was in 2014 when the police chief, Harto, invited them to come in and make recommendations. They did come to Minneapolis, and they had like a 30-page report on things that could be done to improve the Minneapolis Police Department. Those, maybe some of them were implemented, but basically that intervention, like the others, pretty much fell by the wayside. The Police Federation has an outsized influence at the Minnesota legislature. And one of the things that I mentioned here in particular, because even under a DFL governor and DFL administration, they lobbied for the Police Officers Discipline Procedure Act of 2012, which stripped civilian review boards from imposing discipline. And, unfortunately, that was signed into law by Governor Dayton. I want to circle back to former Mayor Fraser because, one of the things that I did with him after we established the Advocates for Human Rights is we would occasionally make trips to other countries to look at their human rights situations. And one of the trips that we did make was to the Philippines. He would always make the observation in these foreign countries that it would be helpful to put the military back in the barracks in the sense that they shouldn't be influencing politics. And that stuck in my mind, especially when I started looking into this about the influence that the Police Federation has exerted over Minneapolis politics, and also the influence that police officers have had in state politics. And yes, the Police Federation was active in convincing the Minnesota Senate to block several good articles that had been proposed by the House of Representatives. Next slide, please. Okay, then I did look at the police chiefs in some detail. One who stuck out to me was Yene Harto, because she was different. She had been a longtime police officer, but she's Native American and openly gay. She is the one who designed that specific program, MPD 2.0, which was designed to increase transparency and accountability. It did show some promise. She invited the Department of Justice to come in and make recommendations. She was widely respected in BIPOC communities. She was named one of the 50 greatest leaders in the world by Fortune magazine in 2017. And shortly later, she was forced to resign after the unfortunate death of Justine Damond, who was murdered by Officer Mohammed Noir in July 2017. And unfortunately, it seems like those proposed reforms just fell by the wayside after she was replaced. Next slide, please. And Chief Arredondo was appointed in 2017. He was the first Black police chief, and then he was reappointed in 2017. The police department did institute some reforms, like the duty to intervene. But I mean, we saw in the murder of George Floyd, did anybody really implement the duty to intervene? because from that, it certainly looked like it was a policy in print only. The police-involved killings have continued under Chief Arredondo. Next slide, please. Okay, these statistics come from the police department's own records. And it's a little bit outdated because I completed this report last December. So there were 22 police-involved killings from January 1st of 2001 through December of 2021. We now know that there is at least one more. Been 5 killings since 2017, and now we know there's been at least one more. But as the New York Times reported, the Minneapolis population is 20% Black, but when police get physical with kicks, chokeholds, punches, takedowns, mace spray, tasers, and the like, the person subject to that force is Black 60% of the time. So I think if we look at both the anecdotal evidence over time, as well as that kind of statistical information, it's pretty obvious that we have a problem with racism in our police department. And I'm not saying only the police department, but that's what I was focusing on in this particular report. And in 2015, the Minnesota Civil Liberties Union also had a report that showed that Blacks and Native Americans are arrested at nearly 9 times higher than the rate of whites. Next slide, please. Okay, so Mayor Fry and Chief Arredondo did make some efforts at reform. I won't say they didn't try. I have several of them listed here. I won't go through them in detail, but you can see those on the city's website and the police department's website. And I think we'll also make this list available, and they're also listed in my paper. But it's not that they didn't try, but I mean, if you look, for instance, at stricter no-knock policies, well, that didn't really amount to anything either, or Amir Locke would still be alive. There's a very flimsy justification for using a no-knock warrant in those circumstances, and nevertheless, that murder took place a block from where we live at our condo in downtown Minneapolis. And that one too was shocking. And I know that they've now concluded that the police officer will not be prosecuted for that. But the kid is still dead. That's the bottom line that I'm looking at here. So next slide, please. Some more reforms that were instituted. Again, I won't go through those in detail, but yeah, the mayor has announced the formation of a 32-member commission that's co-chaired by Nakeem Levy-Armstrong and Reverend Dwayne Davis. As far as I know, they're doing their work. They've had some meetings. They're close to the public, so we don't really know what, if any, progress is being made, but at least there's a commission looking into it. And frankly, given the long history of commissions used to look in various issues over time, I'm somewhat skeptical about blue ribbon commissions being appointed to address issues, because they do look into them, they do write reports, and unfortunately, like the Kerner Commission report that was written in 1968, when riots erupted in many parts of the United States, including right here in Minneapolis. And it's a wonderful report, but nothing seems to have changed. And that makes me very distraught. Next slide, please. Okay, the Minnesota legislature, the House passed 3 bills, and the Senate passed a narrower bill. A compromise bill was passed. The compromise bill did accomplish some things, but it was very, very scaled down from what they had passed in the House of Representatives. But I've kind of summarized it here. I think it's nice that they created a missing and murdered African American women task force and an office dedicated to investigating murdered Indigenous people. So I'm not saying it accomplished nothing, but there's a lot more that it could have accomplished that it just didn't. Next slide, please. Okay, and then President Trump signed an executive order in the Rose Garden to much acclaim. Mainly what he focused on was complementing police officers. It did mandate some additional training and increased involvement by health professionals, a limited ban on chokeholds. But as I state here, it's all of limited effect because state and local laws control most of the regulation of police forces. And again, at the national level, the US House passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which would have accomplished some things. But the Senate wouldn't pass it, and mainly they reached an impasse over limiting qualified immunity. So there we sit in terms of the federal efforts. Next slide, please. Okay, now I want to kind of launch into the things that I view as possibly positive interventions. Chief Arredondo did invite the Department of Justice to launch a pattern or practice investigation, which they have done. The Minneapolis Department of Human Rights is conducting an investigation. The Minneapolis Civil Rights Department is conducting a civil rights investigation. The Minneapolis Department of Civil Rights has very limited resources. And of course, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights also has very limited resources, even though they have jurisdiction to cover this. The Department of Justice has more resources to the extent that they're used effectively. But as I mentioned here, the Department of Justice has made inquiries and investigations of the MPD going back decades. And some of those reports are also referred to in Dr. Milligan's report in the mid-1980s. And then, of course, there was the intervention in 2014. Frankly, I think those haven't made much of a difference. So while I'm cautiously optimistic about the idea that they are doing a pattern or practice investigation, I have to admit that we should have some skepticism because this isn't the first time the Department of Justice has looked into abuses of force by the Minneapolis Police Department. Next slide, please. How are we doing on time?
We're at 3:40.
Okay. Okay, I think we're doing okay, but let me know if I need to skip any of these things. Professor Maria Ponomarenko, University of Law School professor who's now leaving, but she's a widely regarded expert on policing. And we interviewed her. And one of the things that she said, not only to us, but she said in other interviews is, there's no silver bullet. So piecemeal reforms are not enough. She has had experience in pattern or practice investigations, and she has helped perform some of them, and she believes they are thorough and effective. We also interviewed Frank Fernandez, who's a retired police chief and city manager. He was actually referred to me by former Mayor Manny Diaz in Miami. He also has participated in some pattern or practice investigations, and he says they do lead to appropriate reforms. I want to issue a caveat about that, though, because of the pattern or practice investigations that have been completed, They have instituted some meaningful reforms, but it also seems that once the consent decrees expire, when there are consent decrees, there's some backsliding that occurs. And so, yes, it may be helpful, but yes, that probably will not be enough. Professor David Schultz at Hamline University, he also teaches a couple of courses at the University of Minnesota Law School. He's very prolific, but I mean, one of the conclusions that he made in an article that he wrote recently is that racism will not disappear from policing until society changes. Then again, I refer to Professor William Green and his skepticism about how the Police Federation distorts attempts at any kind of civilian authority. Chuck Turchik, who some of you may know, is a longtime activist. And recently he has been, I would say, hounding the city of Minneapolis, the mayor, the city council members, the police chief about, well, whatever did happen to that 2014 report? And I think he may have been following up on that since 2014, but all he's ever gotten is a runaround. He's never gotten any kind of a specific answer. And a lot of times they don't even respond to him. So he, among others, are very skeptical and very frustrated. And then I do mention that there were several local groups that support replacing the police department with the Department of Public Safety. So let's skip to the next slide. Okay, this gives some more details about pattern or practice investigations. I will note here that that 42 USC section 14141 was what was signed into law after the Rodney King beating. It's since been moved to a different section of the United States Code, but it's essentially the same. I have the citation, I just don't have it right in front of me, but that's not the current authorization, but it is still in force. So the Attorney General has decided to open an investigation. The investigations include ride-alongs, community interviews, data analysis. As I've been told, they're very extensive. I've been interviewed by the Department of Justice, and they've also asked me for names of other people who should be interviewed. And so if any of you have any names that you want to send to me, I'll be happy to provide them as long as the people are willing to talk to the Department of Justice investigators. They do promise privacy and confidentiality, but I do know people who feel they've been burned in the past and that there are retaliations by police officers. So I understand people being reluctant, but for those who are willing to step forward, if you provide the names to me, I will pass them on to the Department of Justice investigators. The people that I talked with were from DC, they weren't local. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this just tells a little bit more information about pattern or practice investigations. Sometimes the Department of Justice decides, well, we can't find a pattern or practice. Pattern or practice basically means they have to have evidence that there is a systemic violation, not just sporadic violations. And there, out of 70 plus investigations, a few have ended that way. And then if that happens, they issue a findings letters that say there's been no finding of a pattern or practice. If they do find a pattern or practice, they enter into negotiations with the city, and it usually ends up in a consent decree and an independent monitoring team. There have been a handful that have been considered to be successful. I think one of the more recent ones that was considered to be a success was in Seattle. I think I refer to that in more detail in my paper. And for a period of time, that one was regarded as being successful. But more recently, and I mean in the past couple of years, that one too seems to have fallen apart. So next slide, please. Okay, and then I get into the what I call the local activist groups. I know there are more than the ones that I have listed here. I just listed these as being perhaps the most widely known. The Community United Against Police Brutality has made recommendations for reform. They're not specifically calling for replacing the police department with the Department of Public Safety. But I think many of their recommendations move in that direction. The next several, and they're more than this, and they're additional individuals who have basically concluded that the Minneapolis Police Department is unreformable, and they're asking to substitute a Department of Public Safety. Some are also asking to substitute various forms of public involvement in oversight of the police department. So there are a variety of things that have been suggested by those groups, and the groups are all still very active. I know a lot of people are more familiar with the proposed charter amendments, including the one to replace the police department with the Department of Public Safety that was defeated. But I think most of these people know that taking one stab at it is not going to be enough. I think these groups are here to stay, and they really do have some very solid proposals. Next slide, please. Okay, another recommendation that I have made is to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's already a task force formed based on a resolution that was passed by the City Council to set up one. That resolution was passed in October of 2020. The work group is working, but it still needs to get some more work done. It's a form of restorative justice. There's a lot have been held in other countries. There are a few that have been held in the United States. I referred to some of them here. There are also some more that I refer to in the paper. And yes, there's one in process here. There's also some other cities that have proposed Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Again, I mentioned them in the paper. I think Philadelphia and Boston and San Francisco. There have been other cities as well. As far as I can tell, what limited information is available, not much has been accomplished by any of them since October of 2020. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's one of the recommendations that I'm especially fond of. And I'll tell you how I arrived at this one. I was talking about the professors at the University of Minnesota Law School, and one of the professors that I mentioned was Professor Neil Lane, and she was the one who taught me the course on international human rights law. Well, among her side gigs, she is the special rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights. And I know Aaron may be familiar with her because he has a particular interest in this area. But she knows the special rapporteur on racism. And in fact, the special rapporteur on racism drafted a statement in June of 2020, and it was signed by Professor Neil Lane and 47 of the special rapporteurs. And I haven't kept count of whether that is all of the special rapporteurs, but if it's not all of them, it's pretty close to all of them. And so we've learned that she's planning a country visit to the United States. She was actually invited to do that by President Biden. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to get several civil society groups, including the local Amnesty chapter, but the advocates for human rights have already indicated that they will join. The Center for Victims of Torture still has it under consideration. I think we can get more what we call civil society groups. I'm skeptical about getting any public body to join. It would be ideal if some of them would, and in fact, it would be smart public relations for them, but it's also an election year and blah, blah, blah. So I'm not planning on getting any support from any public officials for somebody to come and look into the issue of racism in Minneapolis. But you know, we're grateful that the local chapter of Amnesty has invited me to make this presentation, and that they're also interested in joining with us to try to get some other groups to join in inviting her. The rapporteur can't mandate anything. What they do is they come and they do an investigation, and again, they make recommendations, very detailed recommendations, and they have a lot of experience. But part of what we're hoping here is that the visit will generate publicity, and maybe it'll help create some political will among the public officials, and hopefully among the voters, to address that. You know, we do have a problem of racism here in Minneapolis. It's not just a code word. It's not just playing the race card. It's a real serious issue, and we have to do something about it. And my paper is focusing primarily on the issue of addressing it with the police force, but you know, we all know there are other areas that need to be addressed in the city of Minneapolis and elsewhere. And so this is just an effort by me to draw some attention to an area that I've learned quite a bit about during the period of time that I've interviewed people who know a lot more about it than I do, and who have a lot more experience than I do. But I'm hoping that this will help generate more interest in making the kinds of reforms that need to be made. So I think that concludes the slides, doesn't it? Oh yeah, I included this this poem by Shamus Haney, and this is something that I thought about, and it's also something that Professor Green has on his website. History says, don't hope on the side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. And I thought, well, maybe the murder of George Floyd and all of the uprising and publicity that it has created would create that kind of event. And I still hope so, but you know, that was now a couple years ago, and we still have a long ways to go if we're going to make hope and history rhyme. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks very much, Jim. That was very impressive. Let's open it up to questions. Aaron. Oh, you're just clapping. Okay. Anybody have any questions for James about the paper?
I have a comment type of question, Jim. I think our culture is to blame for nearly all of this, because we are inundated in TV shows up the wazoo about murders and vile people doing them. And I can see that the police, if they watch the same crap the average civilian watches, they really think that they could be killed on any given day from a doofus with a gun. And so to me, it's a little harder to blame the cops for shooting first when our whole society worships guns, adores guns, and I'm afraid even people who are violent prone tend to use guns a lot. So I think there's some violence throughout our society. And I'm just kind of wondering what aspects of this can be offset by reports, commissions, training, et cetera.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. That's a big question. I do agree with you that it permeates our culture. And in fact, I almost think it's baked into our culture. I mean, the heroes of the Wild West, the conquering of the West, our military exploits, the rate of gun ownership. Those are huge issues that we have to address. And no, I don't attribute it all solely to the racism of the Minneapolis Police Department. They're part of society, but as even some of the policing experts indicated to me, lawyers don't carry guns, at least not in their professional life. Doctors don't carry guns. They are held accountable if somebody dies. And police officers do carry guns in the line of duty. And if they abuse them, it has fatal consequences. And so they do need to be held to a higher standard in terms to how they use those weapons. Police officers in other societies, for the most part, don't carry guns. The police officer that I referred to in Canada is now retired, and he told me he never shot his gun in the line of duty the entire time that he was an active police officer. So, and I mean, in terms of even some of these other efforts, like the no-knock warrants, the city of St. Paul doesn't use no-knock warrants. I don't know if their rate of crime is higher than the city of Minneapolis. I don't believe so. But even that most recent one, I mean, it was initially a warrant issued by St. Paul. It was executed out of Minneapolis. St. Paul didn't request a no-knock warrant. Minneapolis went ahead and got one, and we saw the outcome of that. And so, some of these reforms can be made that will make a difference. And I agree with Professor Ponomarenko, there is no silver bullet, but I don't think that should stop us from trying.
Say, Jim.
Jim, we have a question from Marianne. Let's go to Marianne and then we'll go to Paul.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, James. That was great. And I totally agree about the guns. I mean, that is, when I see things on Nextdoor and, things are happening to people in various places, they have packages stolen, they have whatever happens. And there is invariably someone who will say, well, I guess we all just need to have a gun. Not the answer. That's not the answer. But my question for you, and I don't know, you may not have even dealt with this in your paper, is about the union, the police union. Is it, I think at one point we all saw quite disturbingly that it was very strong politically. And is that still the case? Do you know, or have you studied that? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I have looked at it. I mean, I guess I'll say I don't have a silver bullet. I think police unions across the board are too strong. Just like on the federal level, I think the Pentagon is too strong. And I think that, we tend to yield to scare tactics when we're dealing with the lobbying that they do. The police departments do the same thing. They thrive on fear. And I think that the police union in Minneapolis and in other places is too strong. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is try to deal with the fact that not all public unions, but that police unions in particular are too strong, and we have to figure out ways to minimize their influence. So that's actually one of the follow-up areas that I'd like to investigate more closely. But I don't have an answer to that right now, except I know it's a problem.
Hello, Jim. Have you done much comparative look at other police departments and what's being done to make change? We've heard examples from like Camden, New Jersey, which did what appeared to be a fairly radical change. How are those worked out, and are those models that can be applied to Minneapolis?
I haven't delved into that in this paper, but again, these people that I talk to who are experts on these pattern or practice investigations, that is one of the specific examples they've offered that they think has been very successful, certainly more successful than in other places. There are a handful of places. That's one that keeps getting mentioned. And yeah, I mean, I agree that merits some closer examination in terms of what did they do that seems to be working. But yes, that one is considered to be quite a positive example.
There's another question from CLC.
You're muted.
CLC, I can unmute you here. Oh, I can't, I guess. *6 on your phone will unmute you.
Maybe you can type your question into the chat.
We'll try and get CLC back on the line. Jim, you talked about the police federation. Is that the same as the police union? And so that's one question. And then the other one is, as we talk about solutions for the police department and policing in Minneapolis, how much does that overlap with just dealing with racism, especially in school funding and things in the Twin Cities as well?
Well, unfortunately, I think those are part of a bundle. And I couldn't tackle it all at once. So I just chipped away at it in terms of tackling this specific thing, mainly because it's something that drew such strong attention from me as a result of the murder of George Floyd. But yeah, those are all issues that need to be addressed. And I mean, unfortunately, I think the research shows that the racial disparities in Minneapolis are among some of the worst in the country.
And hello, I'm back with my microphone. I think it's working now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So this has been a fantastic presentation. A lot of what you are presenting on, confirms, I think, probably most of the listeners' views on what has happened over time in the history of the MPD. I'm wondering if you've looked at, or someone's looking at, the ability for the mayor in particular to influence the MPD and how it conducts its work, setting aside policy. I mean, you did mention that writing on paper only goes so far, and I think that's very true. And we can have great policies that are written and improved upon, but it really comes down to implementation and enforcement. And to me, and full disclosure here, my name is Clint Connor, and I ran for mayor in the last go around. One of the things that I think is lacking, and I think can be very influential in how policing changes, is a mayor that actually digs in to the police department and uses the pulpit that a leader has on that level. And I'm wondering if you've seen, in your research, instances where the mayor in particular, who our mayor in Minneapolis has been, the lead of the police department going back decades, the undisputed leader. And I'm wondering if, the mayor, given that the mayor has access to the media like no other, and the pulpit like no other, if you've seen examples where the mayor's been able to, using the media and influence, change how the MPD operates, setting aside policy.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that question. Yes, I do recognize you. I did follow the recent election very closely, and I knew that you were a candidate. I appreciate that you're here, and I appreciate that question. I do agree with you that mayors could do more. In those I looked at in terms of our past mayors, a lot of them have had good intentions, but they deal with so many issues. And when it comes to dealing with this particular issue, their attention seems to get diverted. And also these administrations change. And as I've looked at these city councils and these various mayors, the Minneapolis Police Federation outlasts them all. And I think that's a factor in why there are waves of attempting to make changes, but then there's a regression, and then it kind of like happens all over again. But yes, I do believe that a mayor who was really intent on addressing this could make a lot of efforts toward reform. And in fact, our longtime friend, Mayor Diaz, at least on his own behalf, claims that they did make some reforms in Miami at various times. I mean, he hasn't held office now for over a decade, and I suspect there has been some regression in the city of Miami too. But what he and Frank Fernandez told me is that after he took a dive into this for a period of at least several months, almost 2 years, there were no police shootings whatsoever in Miami. And they were kind of saying, well, this is an example of what can be done. Maybe it needs to be more long lasting, but it's not impossible. And so I agree that I have my own misgivings about whether the current direction is correct. I think that you and some of the other candidates had some very strong points. I think it kind of goes back to what I was mentioning before, that there always seems to be a backlash. And I mean, I even saw here in one of the comments about the question about the social media group next door. And I mean, I agree with the comment here, because I belong to that group, but I rarely look at it because I'm so disgruntled at it. And it's a fear-mongering group. So I do appreciate that observation in the comments, that there are a lot of groups. I mean, it's not just public officials and not just police officers. There are a lot of private citizens who are engaging in this fear-mongering. And so, yeah, I don't want to say we in this room are all part of the problem, but we collectively are part of the problem.
One more question from Mike Levy.
Great presentation. Your two favorite projects, the Truth Commission, Truth and Reconciliation, and the Special Rapporteur. On the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, one thing we learned in Haiti was that the body that commissions the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is key, because it sets up the working rules and it assigns where the report is going to go. And our problem was that the body that was supposed to implement the recommendations wasn't going to be in power long enough to succeed, and didn't have the proper authority. So it'll be really interesting to work that out in the best possible way. And on the Special Rapporteur, I'm thinking of, is there overlap between the mandate of the DOJ investigation and the Special Rapporteur, so that there can be some way to funnel and coordinate witnesses who are going to be perhaps testifying before both agencies? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Those are both great questions. They're still in the process of setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here. I think they can learn from examples in other places because some have worked better than others. And so I think finding a way to give input to that work group, which is 5 or 6 people, is very important. And I think since you've had some experience on that, it would be helpful for you to give some input. I'm going to try to give some input because I knew about them before, but I never took as close a look as I have in the course of this project. And I've connected with some of the people in some other places who have worked on them, and I have some ideas that I'd like to recommend to them. But I think your observation is totally true. It depends on how it's set up. And I think I even mentioned in the paper that some of them have been underfunded. But I mean, yeah, what do you do with the report? That second question about whether the work that a special rapporteur does can somehow be interwoven with the pattern or practice investigation, I believe the answer is yes. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that that I suggested it. I mean, the special rapporteur is planning her country visit this fall. The Department of Justice is still kind of in the middle of at least the phase where they're starting to interview people. I don't know how far they've gotten in terms of working with the police department data and looking at their policies and so on. But I know they just contacted me and I'm assuming that there are lots of other people that they are going to need to talk with. And so I think they're quite early in the stage of talking to people. And certainly if there's information available from the special rapporteur and her staff, it can be useful to them. And I totally agree with you that let's not work in silos. Let's all work together and try to accomplish the most that we can.
Great. Jim, I want to thank you for giving this presentation. It's been very enlightening and we really appreciate you being here. We look forward to working with you. Jim and I are working on getting a sign-up form on our website with a landing page so that people can find out more about signing, having their organization sign up to be part of the letter that will be presented. Jim, do you want to share just a little bit about that process as you see that happening?
I hope it'll happen because I think that, I mean, I have been in contact with the legal advisor for the special rapporteur. In fact, I got to know him personally a couple of years ago before he became the legal advisor. He's a University of Minnesota Law School graduate. Very, very sharp young guy. And so, yeah, we've been in contact with him. And what we're being told is that she is strongly leaning toward coming here. But I think what will help most is that we get as many groups as possible to join in inviting her, because that'll show a sign of support that will also strengthen the outcome of her report. So I think, you know, coalitions are great things. So I'd like to build as strong a coalition as possible to support this. I think we're in the early stages of doing that. Her visit is planned for this fall, but I'd like to get as many groups as possible to join in signing a letter encouraging her. I don't necessarily even say inviting her, because I think she's leaning toward coming here, but encouraging her to come here. And I think that will make a difference because she hasn't finalized our itinerary yet.
Yep. So just to share with everybody, we're planning an open letter. That letter will be available on our website, along with a sign-up form for groups to sign on to that letter. And that'll be presented on that page. And we're still coming up with a date, but in May, we'll have a kind of a deadline, and we will package up that letter and the signatures and send that letter on and announce that. And so that's our next action step in making this happen. So, okay. Anything else, Jim?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being so attentive and asking such good questions, and encouraging you to go out and spread the word. Because
Yeah.
the more people and the more groups that we get involved in doing this, the better it's going to be.
And we'll share this recording with our groups and we'll send out the link that people can send that out. All right, with that, let's conclude our presentation with Jim. Thanks for a really enlightening presentation. We'll send out a follow-up with a link to this recording and a link to the paper, which is on Google Docs for everyone to read and review there. And then also the link to the website with the open letter. Thanks everyone for coming and have a great Sunday.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.